On August 21st, 2026, Dolly Parton was still talking about the future. She was still looking ahead, still full of passion, and still speaking, as though there were many new chapters of her life waiting to be written. But just 4 days later, everything changed. At the age of 80, Dolly Parton suddenly passed away, leaving millions of fans around the world stunned. How could someone who was still talking about the future just days earlier be gone so suddenly? And were there warning signs that the public had failed to recognize? Yet, as the shock of her death gradually began to fade, another question emerged. One that had nothing to do with her music, her fame, or even her final days. Who will inherit Dolly Parton's enormous fortune, estimated at as much as $450 million? Dolly had no biological children. Her husband, Carl Dean, had also passed away. So who will inherit the fortune she spent more than 6 decades building? And perhaps the question that has made people even more curious is, why did Dolly never have children of her own? Was it a personal choice? A sacrifice she made for her extraordinary career? Or was there another story behind it? Before her death, did Dolly Parton have a will in place? Had she already decided who would receive her fortune and how her wealth would be used? And exactly where did Dolly Parton's $450 million fortune come from? The answers will reveal a side of Dolly Parton's life that many of her fans may have never known. Part 2. The $450 million fortune and the mystery of her heirs. After the shock of Dolly Parton's sudden death, one question began to attract almost as much attention as her final days. What would happen to the enormous fortune she had spent more than 6 decades building? Her wealth was estimated at around $450 million. But unlike many celebrities whose fortunes are tied mainly to music sales or acting contracts, Dolly Parton had created something much larger. She had transformed her name, her songs, and even her image into a powerful business empire. And there was one detail that made the question of her inheritance especially intriguing. Dolly had no biological children. Her husband, Carl Dean, had also passed away. So when Dolly was gone, who would ultimately inherit everything she had built? Would the money remain within her extended family? Would some of it go to the people closest to her? Or could a significant portion be directed toward the charitable causes she had supported for decades? To understand the mystery, we first have to understand where Dolly's fortune actually came from. One of her greatest financial assets was her music catalog. Throughout her extraordinary career, Dolly wrote more than 3,000 songs, creating a library of intellectual property that could continue generating income long after the songs were written or performed. That is where royalties became so important. A song does not necessarily stop making money when an artist stops performing it. Every time music is licensed, recorded, broadcast, or used in certain commercial projects, the rights holders can continue receiving payments. Dolly understood the long-term value of songwriting better than almost anyone. Her famous composition, "I Will Always Love You," became an extraordinary example of that principle. Even decades after Dolly first wrote the song, its enormous popularity continued to generate royalties and demonstrate how valuable a great piece of intellectual property can become over time. But music was only one part of the fortune. Another enormous piece was Dollywood. What began as a theme park associated with Dolly Parton eventually became the center of a much broader entertainment empire. Her business interests extended beyond the main park to attractions, a water park, resorts, and other ventures connected to the Dolly Parton brand. In other words, Dolly did not simply become famous and then attach her name to a business. She turned her name itself into an asset. Then there was real estate. Over the years, Dolly accumulated valuable properties, including homes connected to her personal life and lifestyle. As property values increased, those holdings became another component of her overall wealth. But perhaps the most interesting part of Dolly's financial strategy was something she humorously referred to as mailbox money. The idea was simple. Build assets that could continue producing income even when she was not standing on a stage. Music royalties could keep arriving. Products carrying her name could generate revenue. Branded businesses could continue operating. Books, cosmetics, merchandise, entertainment ventures, and other products could turn Dolly's identity into a source of continuing income. This was more than celebrity merchandising. It was the creation of a global personal brand. Dolly Parton had taken the name of a girl who grew up in poverty and transformed it into an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But here's where the story becomes much more fascinating. If Dolly had accumulated so much wealth, why did she spend so much of her life giving it away? If she had no biological children, did that change the way she thought about inheritance? And if her fortune could be passed from one generation to another, was money really the legacy Dolly wanted to leave behind? Perhaps the most important question is not who would inherit Dolly Parton's $450 million fortune. It is this: if money was never the most important thing to Dolly, then what did she truly want to leave behind? Part 3. The poor little girl in a house without electricity. To understand why Dolly Parton eventually became one of the most generous women in America, we have to go back to where her story began. 1946, Tennessee. The Appalachian Mountains. Long before the millions of dollars, the fame, the theme parks, and the worldwide recognition, Dolly was simply a little girl growing up in a large family with very little money. The Parton family lived in a small log cabin in the mountains of Tennessee. There was no electricity, no running water, and very few of the basic conveniences that many people today would consider essential. Dolly was one of many children in the family, and with so many mouths to feed, life was a constant struggle. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, worked hard at manual jobs to provide for everyone. He was known as a hardworking and capable man, but no matter how much effort he put into earning a living, there was never much money left over. Dolly would later describe her childhood in remarkably simple terms. They were extremely poor. But poverty was not the only thing that defined those early years. There was something else inside that little cabin that would eventually change Dolly's entire life: music. The Parton family did not have expensive possessions, but they had songs. Dolly's mother loved to sing, and the children grew up surrounded by the traditional melodies and stories of the Appalachian Mountains. Music became part of everyday life. It did not require electricity. It did not require expensive equipment. It could exist anywhere, even inside a small home where almost everything else was in short supply. For young Dolly, music became something more than entertainment. It became an escape. When life was difficult, she could sing. When money was scarce, she could write. And when the world around her seemed limited, music gave her a way to imagine something bigger. But there was one detail from Dolly's childhood that would leave an even deeper mark on her. Her father could not read or write. Robert Lee Parton was hardworking, intelligent, and practical. But he had never been given the opportunity to receive a proper education. For a young Dolly, watching her father struggle with something as fundamental as reading was deeply meaningful. Imagine growing up in a home where there was little money, few opportunities, and where your own father, despite all his intelligence and hard work, had been denied something as basic as literacy. That experience stayed with Dolly. Years later, when she had become wealthy and successful, she did not simply forget the girl she had once been. She remembered her family. She remembered the limitations created by poverty. And most importantly, she remembered her father's inability to read. That memory would eventually become one of the seeds of one of the greatest charitable projects associated with her name. But before that happened, Dolly still had a long road ahead. She had to find a way out of the mountains. She had to turn a childhood love of music into a career. And she had to prove that a little girl from a poor family could dream far beyond the boundaries of her hometown. Even as a child, Dolly began writing songs. Music was no longer simply something she heard at home. It was becoming something she could create herself. Around the age of 7, she received a guitar from her uncle Bill Owens. That simple instrument would become one of the most important objects in her life. By the time she was around 10, Dolly had already appeared on television and was earning money through singing. Think about the journey. A little girl who grew up without electricity was already performing for audiences. A child whose family struggled to afford basic necessities was beginning to discover that her voice could become her future. And a girl who watched her father struggle because he had never learned to read would eventually build a life centered not only on music, but also on giving children opportunities that her own family had lacked. Dolly would eventually leave Tennessee for Nashville. She would become a songwriter, a singer, an actress, a businesswoman, and one of the most recognizable entertainers in America. But the foundation of that extraordinary life was built long before the world knew her name. It was built inside a small cabin in the mountains. It was built through poverty. It was built through music. And it was built through the memory of a father who could not read. Years later, Dolly would have the money to buy almost anything she wanted. But she chose to use part of that success to give children something her father had never been given: the opportunity to open a book and discover a different world. And perhaps that is the most important clue to understanding Dolly Parton's fortune. Because before she learned how to make money, she learned what it felt like to live without opportunity. And that lesson would follow her for the rest of her life. Part 4. The Coat of Many Colors and the Dream of Nashville. Before Dolly Parton became a household name, before she filled concert halls and built a business empire, there was a little girl in Tennessee who learned an important lesson about poverty, love, and self-worth. It began with a coat. Dolly's family did not have enough money to buy her a new one, so her mother, Avie Lee, gathered leftover scraps of fabric and carefully sewed them together to make a colorful coat for her daughter. To Dolly, it was beautiful. It was made with her mother's hands. It was a gift created from love, and she was proud to wear it. But when Dolly went to school, the other children did not see it that way. They saw a coat made from scraps. They saw a poor girl, and they made fun of her. Dolly went home in tears, hurt by the words of the other children. For a young girl, that kind of humiliation could have easily become a lifelong source of shame. But her mother gave her a lesson that Dolly would carry with her for decades. Being poor in money did not mean being poor in love. Her family might not have had the things other children had. They might not have been able to buy expensive clothes or enjoy the comforts that seemed ordinary to others. But they had something money could not buy. They had love. That lesson became deeply connected to Dolly's identity. Years later, when she was wealthy enough to buy almost anything she wanted, she still remembered that handmade coat. What once represented poverty became a symbol of her mother's love and one of the most meaningful memories of her childhood. And perhaps that is why Dolly never completely separated success from where she came from. She knew what it felt like to have less. She knew what it felt like to be embarrassed because of money. And she knew that a person's value could never truly be measured by the clothes they wore or the possessions they owned. But there was another gift from her childhood that would eventually change everything: music. Around the age of 7, Dolly began learning to play the guitar. She also started writing songs while she was still very young. For most children, music might have been nothing more than a hobby. For Dolly, it was becoming a possible escape from poverty. The guitar gave her something that money could not provide: a voice. She could turn the emotions of her childhood into songs. She could take the stories she heard around her home and transform them into melodies. And slowly, the little girl from the mountains began to understand that perhaps music could take her somewhere far beyond the life she had known. By the time Dolly was around 10 years old, she had already appeared on television and was earning money from singing. Think about how remarkable that was. Only a few years earlier, she had been the girl wearing a coat made from scraps. Now she was beginning to perform in front of audiences. The dream was no longer imaginary. It was becoming real. But Dolly knew that if she wanted to become a professional musician, she would eventually have to leave the familiar world of her hometown. That meant taking a frightening step: Nashville. For a young girl from the Tennessee mountains, Nashville represented opportunity. It was the center of the country music world, a place where talented musicians could turn songs into careers. Dolly left the environment she knew and pursued that dream. She carried with her something much more valuable than money. She carried her songs, she carried her voice, and she carried the lessons her mother had taught her. The little girl who had once cried because other children mocked her family's poverty would eventually stand on stages in front of millions of people. But her success would not happen overnight. There would be years of hard work, songwriting, performances, setbacks, and difficult choices before Dolly became the legend the world knows today. And that makes her story even more fascinating. Because the fortune she eventually built did not begin with a business plan. It began with a guitar. It began with a child who refused to believe that poverty had to determine her future. And it began with a mother who taught her that love mattered more than money. So how did that little girl, the one who once did not even have a store-bought coat, eventually become one of the wealthiest and most influential women in entertainment? How did Dolly Parton turn a childhood dream into a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars? The answer would come from much more than singing. It would come from her ability to turn songs into intellectual property, fame into a brand, and a simple name into an extraordinary business empire. Part 5. From music star to the Dolly Parton empire. Dolly Parton's journey to becoming one of America's most recognizable entertainers did not stop when she found success as a singer. She kept expanding. First came the songwriter, then the singer, then the actress, and eventually the entrepreneur. Each step added another layer to the fortune and influence she would build over the course of her extraordinary career. But perhaps the most powerful asset Dolly ever created was not a building, a theme park, or even a bank account. It was her music. With more than 3,000 songs associated with her songwriting career, Dolly created a vast catalog of intellectual property. And unlike a concert ticket, which can only be sold once, a successful song can continue generating value for decades. That is the extraordinary power of royalties. A song can be recorded by another artist. It can appear in a movie. It can be played on radio stations. It can be licensed for commercial use. And depending on the rights involved, those uses can continue producing income for the songwriter long after the original recording has faded from the charts. Dolly understood that power. One of the clearest examples was, "I Will Always Love You." Dolly wrote the song years before Whitney Houston's legendary version introduced it to an entirely new generation through The Bodyguard. The enormous success of Houston's recording demonstrated something that Dolly had understood for years. A great song can outlive its creator's original performance. The value was not simply in singing the song once. The value was in owning the rights. That distinction helped Dolly build a financial foundation that could continue working even when she was not on stage. But Dolly did not stop with songwriting. She understood something that many entertainers never fully achieve. Her name had become an asset. People recognized Dolly Parton not only as a country singer, but as a personality, a storyteller, an actress, a cultural icon, and a symbol of Tennessee and American entertainment. And she knew how to turn that recognition into business. Perhaps the biggest example was Dollywood. Located in Tennessee, Dollywood became far more than a theme park carrying a celebrity's name. It developed into the centerpiece of a broader entertainment empire. The business expanded beyond the main park to include Dollywood's Splash Country, a water park, as well as Dreamore Resort and Spa, and other entertainment ventures connected to the Dolly Parton brand. This was a completely different way of thinking about fame. Dolly was no longer simply asking, "How many people will buy my next record?" She was building businesses that could continue operating whether or not she was standing on a stage. Visitors could come to Dollywood. Families could stay at the resort. People could buy products carrying her name. And her music could continue generating royalties. Each part strengthened the others. The theme park reinforced the brand. The brand strengthened the businesses. The music created another source of income. And Dolly's personality connected everything together. This was how a singer gradually became an entrepreneur. But there was another important piece of the puzzle. Dolly also expanded her name into products and merchandise. Her brand appeared across areas far beyond traditional country music, including books, beauty products, home-related items, food, and other consumer products. The strategy was simple but incredibly powerful. Dolly Parton did not have to be physically present for the Dolly Parton name to keep working. That was the meaning behind the phrase mailbox money. Royalties, licensing, branded products, and business interests could continue producing income while she was writing another song, recording another album, traveling, or simply spending time away from the spotlight. It was a remarkable transformation. The little girl who once grew up in a house without electricity had learned how to turn creativity into intellectual property. The young singer who once dreamed of Nashville had learned how to turn fame into a business. And the woman who had once been mocked for wearing a handmade coat eventually created a brand recognized around the world. But perhaps the most fascinating part is this. Dolly never seemed interested in becoming wealthy simply for the sake of being wealthy. The fortune gave her something else. The ability to control her own future, support her family, build businesses, and give enormous amounts of money to causes she believed in. So when people look at Dolly Parton's estimated $450 million fortune, they are really looking at the result of several different worlds coming together. Music, royalties, entertainment, real estate, branding, and business. Dolly Parton did not simply sell music. She turned her own name into a business. And that business would eventually give her something far more valuable than money. The power to decide what her success would mean. But there was still one question waiting beneath it all. If Dolly had built an empire without having biological children, who did she consider her family? And what did she truly want to leave behind? Part 6. No children, but millions of children to love. There was one part of Dolly Parton's life that often made people curious. For all her success, all her fame, and all the years she spent in the public eye, Dolly and her husband, Carl Dean, never had children of their own. They married in 1966, beginning a relationship that would last for nearly 6 decades. Yet the family they once imagined never came in the way they had expected. Dolly had once dreamed of having a large family. Like many young women, she imagined what it might be like to raise children and watch them grow. But her life took a very different direction. Her career became increasingly demanding. Writing songs, recording music, performing, traveling, acting, and building businesses required an extraordinary amount of time and energy. Dolly understood that becoming a mother while maintaining that kind of life would have created difficult choices. She once explained that if she had children, leaving them behind whenever she had to tour would have been extremely difficult for her. She knew she would worry about them and feel guilty about being away. So gradually, Dolly came to see her life differently. Perhaps motherhood had simply taken another form. Instead of having a few children of her own, she began to think about the possibility of helping millions of children. And that idea would eventually become one of the most meaningful parts of her legacy. There was a deeply personal reason behind it. Dolly never forgot her father, Robert Lee Parton. He had worked hard throughout his life. He was intelligent and capable, but he had never received the education that might have allowed him to read and write. For Dolly, that memory never disappeared. She knew what it meant to grow up poor. She knew what it meant for a child to have limited opportunities. And she knew that something as simple as a book could open a door to a completely different world. Then, in 1995, Dolly created the Imagination Library. The idea was remarkably simple. Children would receive a new, age-appropriate book every month, free of charge, regardless of their family's financial circumstances. At first, it was a program connected closely to the community where Dolly had grown up. But it would eventually become something much larger. The little girl who had grown up in a home without electricity was now using her success to place books in the hands of children. The daughter of a father who could not read was helping children discover the power of reading. And the woman who had once known what it felt like to have very little was creating opportunities for families who might otherwise struggle to provide books for their children. This is where Dolly's story takes an unexpected emotional turn. For years, people might have looked at her lack of biological children as something missing from her personal life. But Dolly gradually seemed to view it through a different lens. She once expressed the idea that perhaps she had not been given children of her own because she was meant to care about children everywhere. That way of thinking transformed the meaning of her life. She did not need to have a house filled with her own children to make a difference in the lives of young people. She could reach children she would never meet. She could give them stories. She could give them imagination. And perhaps most importantly, she could give them something her own father had never been given: an opportunity to learn. The scale of the imagination library eventually became extraordinary. According to the story presented in this documentary, more than 332 million books had been distributed to children around the world by the time of Dolly's death, with millions of children participating each month. The program expanded beyond the United States, reaching children in countries including Canada, the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Australia. Suddenly, the question of whether Dolly had children seemed much less simple. She may not have had biological children, but her influence reached millions of them. And this may be one of the most powerful transformations in her entire story. The girl who grew up watching her father struggle with illiteracy became the woman who helped millions of children discover books. The child who once experienced poverty became a woman who used her wealth to create opportunity. And the woman who never became a mother in the traditional sense found another way to leave something behind for the next generation. That is why the Imagination Library was more than a charitable project. It was personal. It was connected to her childhood, her family, her father, and the lessons she had learned long before she became famous. And perhaps this explains something about the fortune Dolly Parton eventually built. She did not simply accumulate wealth. She used her success to expand the number of lives she could touch. So when the question eventually became, who will inherit Dolly Parton's fortune? Perhaps there was another answer hiding underneath it. Maybe Dolly's greatest inheritance was never meant to belong to one person. Maybe it was meant to belong to the children who opened those books. Millions of children she never gave birth to, but millions of children whose futures she helped change. And that brings us to the next question. If Dolly spent so much of her fortune helping others, just how much did she give away? And what did she want to happen to that mission after she was gone? Part 7. $600 million given away and Dolly's final wishes. For most people, a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars would be the ultimate measure of success. For Dolly Parton, it seemed to be something different. It was a tool to help children, a tool to support families, a tool to give people opportunities she knew could change their lives. According to the story presented in this documentary, Dolly Parton was estimated to have given away more than $600 million throughout her career. That number is almost impossible to imagine. But perhaps the most remarkable part was not the amount itself. It was where the money went. Education remained one of Dolly's most important causes. Through the Imagination Library, children received free books regardless of their family's financial circumstances. What began as a deeply personal project connected to Dolly's childhood eventually grew into an international effort reaching millions of children. But Dolly's commitment to education went far beyond books. Through the Dollywood Foundation, she also supported programs designed to encourage young people to stay in school. One early initiative promised financial rewards to students who completed high school, helping motivate teenagers in the communities where Dolly herself had grown up. She also provided college scholarships to students who might otherwise have struggled to afford higher education. The message behind these programs was simple: poverty should never decide how far a child is allowed to go. That belief was deeply connected to Dolly's own childhood. She knew what it meant to grow up with limited opportunities. She knew how easily financial circumstances could determine a person's future. So when she gained the ability to change those circumstances for others, she did. Her generosity also extended into healthcare. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Dolly donated $1 million to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, supporting medical research. She also gave significant financial support to a children's hospital connected to her family. These contributions reflected another side of Dolly's philanthropy. She was not simply interested in helping people after something went wrong. She wanted to support the institutions that could prevent suffering, improve treatment, and give families hope. Then came another area where Dolly repeatedly stepped forward: disaster relief. When devastating wildfires struck the Great Smoky Mountains region in 2016, families lost their homes and communities were left struggling to recover. Dolly responded through the My People Fund, providing millions of dollars in assistance to affected families. Years later, she continued supporting people facing the aftermath of natural disasters. Her philosophy seemed consistent. When people lost everything, she wanted to help them rebuild. And her generosity did not stop with strangers. Dolly also remembered the people who worked for her. Through Dollywood, employees were given opportunities to pursue higher education, with support for tuition, books, and fees. That detail reveals something important about the way Dolly viewed success. She did not simply want to build a company that made money. She wanted the people working inside that company to have opportunities to improve their own lives. In that sense, her fortune became a kind of chain reaction. She earned money through music and business. She invested some of it into companies and projects. Those projects created jobs and revenue. And then she used her wealth to create more opportunities for other people. But after Dolly's death, another detail made her final wishes particularly meaningful. Her family asked fans not to focus on sending expensive funeral flowers. Instead, they encouraged people to support the Imagination Library, the charitable mission that had become one of Dolly's proudest legacies. Think about the symbolism. Even in death, Dolly's story was being redirected toward children. Instead of flowers that would fade after a few days, her supporters could help provide books that might influence a child for years. Instead of turning grief into something temporary, her family was asking people to turn it into something useful. And that brings us back to the mystery surrounding Dolly's fortune. Did she prepare for this moment long before the public ever knew it was coming? Did she carefully decide how her wealth should be divided? Had she already planned what would happen to her businesses, her music rights, her properties, and her charitable organizations? Dolly had once spoken about the importance of having a clear will, so that families would not be left fighting over an estate after someone died. That suggests she understood that enormous wealth could create enormous complications. But perhaps the deeper question is not simply whether Dolly prepared her will. It is this. When she prepared for the end of her life, did she think only about who would receive her money? Or did she think about how her money could continue helping people after she was gone? Because if Dolly Parton truly believed that wealth was most valuable when it could be passed on to others, then her final wishes were not simply about inheritance. They were about continuation, the continuation of education, the continuation of generosity, the continuation of opportunity. And perhaps that is why the question becomes so haunting. How long had Dolly been preparing for this day? And when the details of her final wishes are finally considered, we may discover that the greatest thing she left behind was never the $450 million fortune at all. Part 8. What did Dolly Parton leave behind after 7 decades? When the news of Dolly Parton's death spread, the reaction was immediate. Across the worlds of country music, Hollywood, and entertainment, friends, colleagues, and artists began remembering the woman behind the legend. They did not speak only about her extraordinary career. They spoke about her kindness. They spoke about her generosity. And they spoke about the way Dolly Parton could make people feel that fame had never changed who she really was. Reba Mcentire, one of Dolly's longtime friends, expressed the sense of loss felt by so many who had known her. For those who worked alongside Dolly, she was not simply another superstar. She was a friend, a mentor, and a person whose presence could leave a lasting impression. Lily Tomlin, who shared the screen with Dolly in 9 to 5, expressed her grief with remarkable simplicity. Sometimes, when someone who has been part of your life for decades is suddenly gone, there are no perfect words. Jane Fonda, another member of the famous 9 to 5 trio, also remembered Dolly for the qualities that went far beyond her fame. Her warmth, generosity, and ability to remain genuine despite reaching the highest levels of success. And the tributes did not come only from Dolly's generation. Artists from different generations and different musical worlds also remembered her. That may be one of the clearest signs of Dolly Parton's influence. She was not simply a country music star. Her songs crossed generations. Her movies reached audiences who might never have listened to country music. Her businesses turned her name into a global brand. And her philanthropy reached people who might never have heard one of her songs. Yet after all those tributes, the question that had been hanging over this story still remained. Who would receive Dolly Parton's $450 million fortune? Her money could be inherited. Her properties could be transferred. Her business interests could pass to other people. Her music rights could eventually belong to new hands. The empire she built could continue operating without her. But then something becomes clear. There are some things an inheritance cannot measure. You can calculate the value of a house. You can estimate the value of a music catalog. You can put a price on a business. You can calculate the value of hundreds of millions of dollars. But how do you calculate the value of a child discovering a book for the first time? How do you measure the impact of a family receiving help after losing its home? How do you place a financial value on giving a teenager the opportunity to finish school? And how much is a dream worth when someone finally gives you the opportunity to pursue it? Those are the questions that make Dolly's story so different. The fortune she accumulated can be divided. The businesses can be sold. The properties can change owners. The royalties can continue flowing to whoever legally controls the rights. But the impact of her generosity is much harder to transfer. According to the story presented in this documentary, hundreds of millions of books were placed into the hands of children through the Imagination Library. Those books did not simply carry stories. They carried possibilities. They gave children something Dolly herself understood from an early age: the ability to imagine a world beyond the circumstances into which they were born. And the families she helped during difficult times may never have appeared on a stage with her. They may never have met her personally, but they knew what her generosity meant when they needed help. That is perhaps the most powerful part of her legacy. Dolly Parton once stepped out of a small, poor home in the mountains of Tennessee carrying a guitar and a dream. She did not begin with wealth. She did not begin with influence. She began with very little. But over 7 decades, she transformed that dream into music, businesses, a fortune, and a worldwide cultural legacy. And when her story finally reached its final chapter, she left behind hundreds of millions of dollars. But that money was not the only measure of her life. Because money can be inherited by a person. A house can be passed to a new owner. A business can change hands. A song can continue earning royalties. But kindness can be passed from one person to another and from one generation to the next. That may be why Dolly Parton's story will continue long after the final accounting of her estate is complete. The real question may never be simply, who inherited Dolly's fortune? Perhaps the better question is, how many lives inherited a little more hope because Dolly Parton was here? The little girl who once wore a coat made from scraps grew into a woman whose name became known around the world. The girl who grew up watching her father struggle with reading helped put books into the hands of millions of children. And the woman who once had almost nothing eventually had the ability to give something back to almost everyone. Dolly Parton may have left behind hundreds of millions of dollars. But what made her name endure was not simply what she owned. It was what she gave away. And perhaps that is the final lesson of her extraordinary life. You can inherit someone's money, but you cannot inherit the love they gave to the world. That is the legacy Dolly Parton leaves behind.